We continue now at the top of Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 62a. This daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a daf, see the description box below and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. The Gemara is discussing various ways a sale can be phrased and what does it include if you use certain phrases. And the Gemara now continues, let's say the seller says to the buyer, Nechosai, that I'm selling my property to you. So then afilu bate v'avdi, so that includes even houses and slaves, meaning it's not just land, but it can be other things that are adjacent essentially to land. And the Rashbam here says, V'yomar le nechasai, he says my property, afilu bate v'avdi, even houses and even slaves. Slaves in general are sometimes considered to be like karka, like land. Avol metaltali lo, but movable objects that would not be included in the word nechasai. But says the Rashbam, adu amar le kol nechasai, unless he says kol nechasai, if he says all of my property, that would include metaltalin as well. And the Gemara continues, Meitzar lo Meitzar echad arach or Meitzar echad katzer. Let's say the person, when he's selling land, when the seller is selling land to the buyer, he gives him one of the boundary lines that's long, and then the other boundary line that's parallel, but he says it shorter than that longer one. So what would be the halacha in that situation? And the Rashbam explains, Meitzar lo hamocher sadel chavero. Somebody sells a field to his friend, to the buyer. Bishtar ha-mechira. Now, in the document of sale, Meitzar ma'aravi oruch meo amma. Let's say the western boundary is 100 amos long. Umeitzar mizrachi kenegdo, and then the boundary line on the east side, which is parallel, which is right opposite, katzar nun amma. That's only 50 amos. Shelo higia elad chatzi hasad. It's only making it halfway to where that other side was, to where the west side was. Umeitzar shel tzafon v'dora miyamin usmol min ha-mizrach ad ha-mayrav kazeh. And then the boundary lines on the north and the south, those are regular. And the diagram is over here. In other words, you have, these are regular, the ones that are along the north and the south are regular boundary lines, but the ones on the east and the west, you have one of them is very long, and the other one only goes halfway. So the question is, what exactly did he sell him in this case? And the Gemara continues on my Rav. Rav says, Lo kana elo keneged hakotzer. The halacha is he's only going to get along the side of the shorter side. He's not going to get the entire field. And the Rashbam explains, Elo keneged hakotzer, keneged meitzar mizrachi yikna. He's going to get along this line over here, this dotted line along the eastern, along the size of the eastern boundary. Dahainu chatzi asada. He's only going to get half of the field. Umeitzar ma'aravi shuarach, and the western boundary line, which was longer. Mitzarim hirchiv lo. That was just the only way he was able to explain it. He had to say that entire line, the boundary line. The meitzar shalim hutzrach lichto b'shtar. There was no other way to write it. We'll see as we continue in the Gemara. There are various circumstances where it's difficult to write exactly what it is, and so therefore here he gave him a longer boundary line, but really he's restricting it to the shorter boundary line. That's all he gets. That's the opinion of Rav. Amrulei Rav Kahana of Ravasi l'Rav. Rav Kahana and Ravasi, they said to Rav, V'yikna keneged rosh tor. So why shouldn't it be a kinyan keneged rosh tor, which the Rashbam will explain here. V'yikna keneged rosh tor kilomar. Ha'ikal amemer, can't we say as follows? The davka kasav lo meitzar marav aruch meitzar mizrach katzer. Maybe he was very specific, and maybe for a reason he wrote that the western one was long and the eastern one was short. What he wants him to do is like this. Make a kinyan along the west side, the full 100 amos. Along the entire length of the boundary line. And he actually wants the eastern side to be 50 amos. The idea is, that's what it means, keneged rosh tor. It's going to be essentially diagonal. Keneged roshei hashuro shel mizrach u'mayrav kazeh. He's going to acquire in the following fashion. Maybe you're supposed to draw the line from this point to that point. That's why one of the boundaries was longer than the other. In this case, this one is longer because he's supposed to draw a diagonal, and this is the property that he's actually going to sell him. And so that's what Rav Kahana and Ravasi, that's what they're asking to Rav. And Rav said, and the Gemara says Shasik Rav. The Gemara says that Rav was quiet, and as we'll see in the Rashbam understands this to mean that Rav actually agreed to what Rav Kahana and Ravasi said, and said that really is the way that the kinyan should work. And the Gemara continues, Umode Rav. Now Rav admits, Heichad Ika Meitzar Ruvain v'Shimon Mechad Gisa. Let's say you have a situation where you have the boundary of Ruvain and Shimon there on one side of the field, and this is what we were alluding to before. Sometimes the way you describe it is based on what the surroundings are. So now we're discussing the surroundings. Let's say you have the boundary line, meaning you have the fields of Ruvain and Shimon on one side. Umeitzar Levi v'Yehuda mechad gisa, and you have the boundary, you have the fields of Levi and Yehuda are on the other side of the field. So there, Rav would admit, Midahavale lemichtav le de Ruvain keneged Levi, de Shimon keneged Yehuda, from the fact that he could have written Ruvain opposite Levi and Shimon opposite Yehuda, V'lo kasavlein, he didn't write it like that. He had an option that he didn't use, and the way he formulated it, Shema mina keneged rosh tor hu damerle. So you see from there that he does mean keneged rosh tor. He does mean to give him in that diagonal fashion. And the Rashbam explains, Umode Rav, and Rav admits mekame d'ishtik, meaning before he was silent, meaning before he admitted to what Rav Kahana and Ravasi said, he already admitted in the following circumstance. The Gemara is essentially saying, yes, Rav ultimately admitted to Rav Kahana and Ravasi that it's always in this triangular, in this diagonal fashion. But even before he admitted to Rav Kahana and Ravasi, he certainly would have admitted in the following case, Aval Basra de Ishtik Odi B'Tarvayu. After he was silent to the question of Rav Kahana and Ravasi, then already he admitted in all cases, but he for sure admitted in the following case. Hey Chadika Meitzar Ruvain v'Shimon Mizrach Umeitzar Levi v'Yehuda Kenegdon b'Mayrav. We'll see here the Rashbam has a slightly different girsa than we have, but the point is essentially going to be the same. If you have the boundary of Ruvain and Shimon in the east, and the boundary of Levi and Yehuda in the west, Barochav Hasada Kuf Amos. So the width of the field is 100 amos. V'havim Meitzar Levi Keneged Ruvain Nun Amma, and the boundary or the field of Levi is exactly opposite Ruvain's field, it's 50 amos. V'chein Meitzar Yehuda Keneged Shimon Nun Amma, and the same thing is true of the boundary of Yehuda, that's opposite Shimon, that's also 50 amos. The cause of lo b'shtar. Now, in this situation, the seller writes to the buyer in the shtar, Meitzar Ruvain v'Shimon min hamizrach. He says, this is what I'm selling to you. Along these boundary lines, it's along the fields, along the boundary of Ruvain and Shimon on the east side. Umeitzar Yehuda min hamayrav, and then the boundary of the field I'm selling you is going to be the boundary of Yehuda in the west. Now, in this situation, he's leaving out Levi over here. He's talking about Ruvain and Shimon. That he's mentioning, but he's leaving out, even though he's mentioning Yehuda, he's leaving out Levi in this situation. Dahainu Meitzar Ma'arav Iktzas, he's essentially giving him only a little of the west. V'Levi lo Hisker, he's not mentioning Levi. So if that's what the seller did, and here we have a diagram of this as well, you have Ruvain and Shimon on this side of the field, they're the neighbors, and then you have Yehuda and Levi, but he didn't mention Levi in the sale. So Hacham Mo de Rav, so here Rav would admit the Yikna Keneged Rosh Tor that certainly in this case it's going to be this triangular kind of sale. You're going to have a line along this side, a diagonal line. Do you have a boy mocher lahaknos keneged hakotzer? Because there was a very simple solution. If he wanted him to have, let's say, keneged hakotzer, he only wanted him to get half the field. Let's say he wanted him to get from only between Yehuda and Shimon. He had an easy solution. Havale lamichtav v'Shimon keneged Yehuda. He could have just written Shimon keneged Yehuda, and then it would have been obvious that he's only selling him this part of the field. From the fact that he says Yehuda and then he says Reuven and Shimon on this side, obviously it's a diagonal line. So in other words, the point is you have circumstances depending on how things are set up with this field where it's obvious what the person means, and that there essentially Rav would admit. Again, Shimon keneged Yehuda klamar Meitzar Mizrachi shu orach lo yikna el Yehuda keneged Shimon. It would have been obvious. He means Yehuda keneged Shimon. Dahainu chatzi asad means half the field. Umidlo kasavachish mamina keneged Rosh Tor kamerle. From the fact that he didn't write it in that simple fashion, clearly he did want it to be in this triangular fashion and have a diagonal boundary line. And the Rashbam continues, Avoli'il b'milse de Rav. Now earlier when Rav said that you're only going to get that short amount, you're only going to get from here to here, from Yehuda opposite Shimon, and not going to get the diagonal. So what was that talking about? Again, Avoli'il b'milse de Rav, Mayri kagon Reuven v'Shimon Meitzar Mizrachi. That case was where Reuven and Shimon are on the eastern boundary, v'Yehuda Meitzar Mayrav keneged Shneim. And Yehuda actually is the entire boundary line opposite them. In that case, there is no real other way that you can formulate it. So in such a situation, v'chasav lo Yehuda Meitzar Mayrav v'Shimon Meitzar Mizrach. Now, if he writes over there, I'm giving you Yehuda on the west side and the boundary of Shimon on the east side, Dahainu echad orach v'echad katzer. There he's giving one long boundary and one short. So hasam lo kana ela keneged hakatzer. There you're only going to get according to where Shimon's boundary ends, meaning to say you're only going to get from here until here, Shimon to Yehuda, and that's it. Because there it's already in such a situation, he had no choice in terms of how to formulate it. Again, the Rashbam says, the seller had no choice but to give him a longer boundary line on the west, because there was no other way to explain it. Yehuda was the only one on the west side. That was just the situation you had where Shimon was halfway, but you didn't have that other possibility by Yehuda, and so that's where Rav said that above. And the Rashbam has here a note about the Girsa near Dahachi Garsinan. It appears that the proper text of the Gemara should be Midhavale Lemechtav Ruven Keneged Levi. It should have written Ruven Keneged Levi. The Mashma Shemetzer Lo Metzer Ruven V'Shimon Aruch Umetzer Levi Hu Akotzer. If you're going to have it according to that Girsa, so then the Metzer Ruven and Shimon is a long one and Levi is the shorter one. Avol Yehuda Lo Hiskir. Yehuda is the one that's not mentioned. V'Nir and Ken Hadvaram Lahamed Achisarn Shal Metzer BeYehuda HaAcharon. So the Rashbam is just noting that he thinks that the way it should be phrased in the Gemara is that Yehuda is the one that was left out. Uve Perush Rabbeinu Chananel Meiroma Garsin, and he says that in Rabbeinu Chananel the gear says Midahavale Lemichtav Meitzer Levi Keneged Meitzer Ruven V'Chayotze Bo Meitzer Yehuda Keneged Meitzer Shimon Umisham Yesh Lamot Shekasa Besvarim Shalahen. From the Rabbeinu Chananel, it seems like was written in the Gemara Midahavale Lemichtav Levi Keneged Ruven. It should have said Levi Keneged Ruven V'Lo Chasav V'Chein Iker, and that is the Iker, that is the proper girsa. And we will note over here that the actual girsa that we do have is Midahavale Lemichtav Ruven Keneged Levi Uda Shimon Keneged Yehuda. The Bach takes out the Shimon Keneged Yehuda. It should just be Midahavale Lemichtav the Ruven Keneged Levi. That's the girsa that the Rashbam is saying there at the end. It's a little different than the girsa that the Rashbam had in the beginning of the Rashbam. The Rashbam's beginning girsa was Hachi Havale Lemichtav Shimon Keneged Yehuda. It should have said Shimon Keneged Yehuda instead of Ruven Keneged Levi. That's the change that the Rashbam is noting. And the Gemara continues, Meitzar Ruven Mizrach Umayrav. Let's say the boundary of Ruven is along the east and west. Umeitzar Shimon Safan V'Darman. Let's say the boundary of Shimon is along the north and the south. So in such a situation, says the Gemara, Tzarech Lemichtav Le Meitzar Ruven Ruchen Train. He's going to have to write the boundary of Ruven on both sides, because again, Ruven's on both the east and the west. Umeitzar Shimon Ruchen Train, and also the boundary of Shimon on both sides, because again, Shimon is on both the north and the south. And if you don't write it in that fashion, there will be a confusion, as the Rashbam here explains. Meitzar Ruven Mizrach Umayrav Hamocher Sadel Lechaveiro V'Rotza Lichtov Mitzra V'Yesh L'Shcheno Ruven Beis Sados. The case over here is Ruven has two fields that surround Achas B'Mizrach V'Achas B'Mayrav, and Shimon the same thing. You have Ruven over here on this side, and Shimon on this side and this side. Lo Yichtav Lo Stam Sadas Ushani Mocher L'Chari B'Soch Sados Ruven V'Shimon. He shouldn't just write that I'm selling you the field that is between the fields of Ruven and Shimon. Diasi L'Mifag Le Balachson Kazeh, because then what you're going to end up doing is you'll just divide it in half with a diagonal and say, here you have a field now that's surrounded by Ruven and Shimon, but he's only going to get a triangle. He's not going to get the full square. That's what's going to happen if you don't make it clear that it's Ruven on both sides and Shimon on both sides. V'nimsa shenotel etzel meitzer Ruven v'Shimon. He's now getting the boundary of Ruven and Shimon even in a triangle. Aval kishakosem meitzer Ruven ruchin tartin umeitzer Shimon ruchin tartin. If he writes both sides Ruven, both sides Shimon, harei arba ruchos, is going to get all four sides. He'll get a square field. And the Rashbam says v'kol shekain, and certainly im yichtov lo beferish meitzer Ruven mizrach u'ma'irav meitzer Shimon safon v'darim. If he clearly writes, I'm giving you Ruven's boundary east and west, Shimon north and south, to Shaper Dummy, then certainly that is going to be sufficient. That will be okay. And the Gemara continues, Iboy Lahu, they had the following question, Sayim lo es akronos ma'u, if he delineates the corners, what's the halacha? Kimin gam ma'u, let's say he gives him boundaries like a gam, which is a letter. We'll see the Rashbam over here, Sayim lo es akronos lashon simin. It means to say like he gives a sign in the following way, Shayu sados harbe shal b'nei adam akifano. So let's say there's a lot of fields surrounding him. V'lo kasav ela arba sados shal dalid kronos hasada. Let's say he only writes the fields that happen to be by the corners. Let's say Ruven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda have fields by the corners of his field. Aval arka v'rachba lo meitzer klal. But let's say he doesn't give anything along the length and the width. Mi amrinan. So do we say ein derech limchor karnos hasada? It's not normal to sell the corners of the field. Alakol hasada shebesocha kronos macharlo. But rather he's selling him the entire field. Everything within is included. The mishamachi saim lo karnosov. That's why he's giving the corners. It really means everything. O dilmor maybe lo macharlo elatelam balachson. Maybe he's only giving him one furrow, one row in the field diagonally. Mikeren lekeren shesiva erev kozeh. Maybe he's giving him just again along this side. It means from Shimon to Levi, from Ruven to Yehuda. Maybe he's giving him just those rows and not giving him the entire field. And the Gemara also asks, Kamin gam os yevonis v'doma l'chaf. A gam is a Greek letter. It's similar to the shape of a chaf. Kagon shemetzar lo karen dromis mizrachis v'karen tzfonis ma'aravis. He tells him about the southeast corner and the northwest corner. V'nimsa shemetzar tchilas kol ruach kazeh, essentially giving him like this. So he delineates the boundaries over here, and he delineates the boundaries over here as well. So what would be the halach over there? Im tim tzolomar, and the Rashbam explains, if you're going to say gabesaim lo es hakronos to lo kona ela keneged hakarnos, let's say you say that when he gives him the corners, he only gets opposite the corners. Hainu mishum dehasam lo saim es haruchos. That's because there, he didn't give anything along the sides. Here, he gave the beginning of each side. He's giving this part, he's giving this part, he's giving this part and this part. So already he's giving part of the sides. So then, Kamisha Mitzer as Kulan Dami, that's like he's giving you the whole field. Vekana Hakol, and he'd acquire the whole field. Dilmor maybe Lokana Labalachsim, because then maybe he should only get a diagonal. In this fashion, you're going to get from here to here, and from here to here, this area in between, that's all you're going to get, but you're not going to get these triangles along the side. That's the question of the Gemara, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Beis Amid Beis.